Okay, so why a hazard and risk assessment of the fire district? Highly detailed wildfire hazard maps can assist in the planning of desired land uses that reduce communities' wildfire risks. By identifying likely wildfire locations and intensities, hazard maps help prioritize areas of concern and guide decision-making efforts. In addition, wildfire hazard maps identify areas where development can take place safely with minimum risk exposure. Wildfire hazard maps can help guide the development review process for proposed subdivisions and existing structures, support education and outreach to homeowners and the public, supplement grant applications and funding requests, and improve regulatory planning with the wildland urban interface. Other benefits of wildfire hazard assessments include providing the ability to stratify land use ordinances and development codes based on low to very high hazard areas, support the development of more detailed structure level risk assessments, educate the public and support outreach efforts to raise awareness of wildfire hazard, provide critical information to community wildfire protection plans, county comprehensive plans, hazard mitigation plans, safety elements, and other guiding documents. Identify the least hazardous locations for neighborhoods and critical infrastructure like power lines and other utilities. Target neighborhoods and communities where enhanced mitigation measures are needed or where socioeconomic vulnerabilities make wildfire. And it provides base information for efforts to model effects of post-fire flooding or other rehabilitation and recovery issues. Assessments of current conditions help land and resource managers better understand how risks are distributed across their landscape, identify which highly valued resources and assets face the greatest expected loss or benefit, and inform decisions relating to preparedness planning and fuel treatment design. Fundamentally, wildfire risk analysis is about seeking answers to several important questions. How large are fires likely to grow? Which HVRAs have the greatest exposure to wildfire hazard? What are the likely effects to HVRAs of fire at different intensity levels? Where might fires cause harm or damage, and where might they lead to benefits? How is wildfire risk distributed across the landscape? And which areas are most likely to experience loss, and how much loss, and to what highly valued resources and assets? Assessments of wildfire risk are critical for informing the development and implementation of cost-effective risk mitigation efforts, and comparative risk assessment can be used as a basis to evaluate different treatment alternatives. Designing efficient fire management strategies involves asking, where can wildfire risk be best mitigated? What treatments and management activities are feasible? Where can different treatments be implemented and to what extent? How will treatments affect various risk factors, likelihood and intensity of fire? How will treatments affect potential impacts to your resources and assets? What combinations of activities can most cost effectively mitigate wildfire risk? So the aim of the hazard and risk assessment is to provide fire and land managers with a helpful set of guiding principles and tools for assessing and mitigating wildfire risk. Another important and critical aspect of a comprehensive hazard and risk assessment is the inclusion of the built environment in the hazard and risk assessment. Woodside Fire Protection District will be including the built environment in our assessment of the fire district, as homes and neighborhoods built in and among the wildlands are not just vulnerable or exposed to wildfire, they are in fact an important cause of catastrophic destruction. Compelling evidence clearly demonstrates that increased density and inadequate separation of buildings from one another can be the most significant cause of home-to-home ignitions and fire spread. By placing ever more man-made structural fuels on hazardous lands and hazardous locations and in hazardous ways, we are exacerbating and indeed creating the very fire hazards that should concern us the most. So why the identification and designation of very high fire hazard severity zones is important? According to CAL FIRE, identification and designation of our highest hazard fire areas is the first and most important step responsible communities can take to reduce the risk. Such designations are needed to ensure that we fully comprehend the magnitude and severity of the hazards we confront, have adequate resources in place before a wildfire, and have the critical advanced knowledge our fire service needs to anticipate fire behavior and manage both suppression and evacuation. Educate decision makers and the public about the hazards we face so they can take appropriate land use, building, and emergency response steps to reduce risks. We can't make prudent development decisions without this information. Qualify for public and private grant funding to abate the risks, retrofit our homes and neighborhoods and provide suitable defensible space, evacuation routes, and mitigation measures to protect us. Adoption of an ordinance by Woodside Fire Protection District that designates all of the very high fire hazard severity zones within the district would ensure consistent application of the state's minimum fire safe development regulations throughout the district. While the state's minimum regulations currently apply in the jurisdictions of the district that have designated their very high fire hazard severity zones by local ordinance, they do not apply in jurisdictions which have not adopted such ordinances. Woodside Fire Protection District has both the authority and the responsibility to identify and designate the fire hazard severity zones within the district. Where substantial evidence shows that our hazard areas extend beyond those identified by CAL FIRE, the district still has the authority to identify and designate them as well. CAL FIRE's Risk Reduction Communities Program. Public Resource Code 4290.1 requires CAL FIRE to establish criteria to identify communities that follow best practices for community risk reduction. CAL FIRE is adopting regulations that establish 10 criteria, 4 are mandatory and 6 optional, and to qualify for listings as a risk reduction community. Communities that make the list receive preferential scoring for CAL FIRE grant funding for wildfire mitigation and planning. The very first mandatory criteria for a risk reduction community is adopting the local ordinance identifying and designating all very high fire hazard severity zones within the community's local response area. To get on the list, a community must satisfy all 4 mandatory criteria and at least 2 of the 6 optional criteria. CAL FIRE's Risk Reduction Communities programs required best practices. Number 1, town ordinance designating very high fire hazard severity zones. Number 2, these are all the required: submission of parcel maps for the very high fire severity zones based on regs. Submission within the past 8 years of an updated safety element that addresses wildfire. And then the 4th is a report on compliance with CAL FIRE recommendations. The 6 optional best practices: ordinance adopting minimum safe development, an ordinance adopting defensible space standards that exceed state's minimum, ordinance adopting a WUI code stricter than the state's, zoning or special district ordinance with fire mitigation requirements that exceed state minimum, an ordinance for comprehensive retrofit of existing homes, and the declaration of wildfire as a high priority hazard. And that's it. If anybody has any questions.